So thank you all for being here, for still being here. I really appreciate that. And I was gonna thank the organizers. It's usually what one does in this situation, but in this case, I am one of the organizers. And so, but I still want to thank myself for inserting myself into this lineup of distinguished sellers, scholars, and luminaries, and some of my philosophical heroes are in the room. And so. I'm grateful to myself for being able to have put myself into this program as though I belong here. So let's see if that could be to some extent justified. Okay, so look, so this project that I'm about to present started off several years ago when I was working on my dissertation, which was on psycholinguistics and Chomskyan linguistics and the philosophy thereof. But at the same time, I was having my mind corrupted in various ways by my graduate school mentor, David Rosenthal, who sort of introduced me to the wonderful world of Salarzian philosophy. And so these are two worlds that rarely collide. Psycholinguistics and Salarzian thought are pretty strange bedfellows. But actually, that fact in and of itself is pretty strange to me. Because if there are two topics that Sellers was deeply interested in, things that he had an abiding interest in, it would be language on the one hand and perception on the other. And so also Sellers was a self-proclaimed naturalist and was himself deeply interested in what's going on in the sciences. And so the fact that we have this science of language perception, namely the science of psycholinguistics, seems like something that would be ripe for mining from a Salarzian standpoint. So that's part of what drove me to write this stuff up. The other thing was I was a little while back reading. I'm actually around this time that I mentioned reading Professor de Vries' introduction to empiricism and philosophy of mind. And at the time, I was not able to understand Sellers, so that was in a way a translation of Sellers into English for me. Now I think I speak Sellersese to some extent. So, but this was very influential. And in one of the footnotes, Professor de Vries has this. He says, or he and his co-authors say, the definitive treatment of the relation between Chomsky, on whose work I had been working on at the time, and Sellers also has yet to be written. And I thought to myself, well, that's a challenge. That's I don't know, maybe somebody's done it, but I don't see it, and I want to start writing that. So this is a chapter. This is maybe an early chapter in that project. Okay, so I'm going to throw a good bit of science at you today, but I wanted to right away dispel the worry that this is just all going to be psycholinguistics. And I want to mention right off the bat some key Salarzian ideas which are going to inform my interpretation, or what I'm going to recommend as should be our interpretation of what's going on in contemporary psycholinguistics. And these Salarzian ideas really do influence my own thinking about when I do look at the psycholinguistic work. Okay, so first and foremost is the stuff that we heard about earlier today about Jones and his posit of psychological states. And I think that's a good posit. When Jones made it, or whoever it was that made it, that was a good posit. And also Sellers' realism about theoretical entities, that they are not second-class citizens in any way, that we should be realists about them. If our good theory posits them, then we should believe that they exist, as I'm going to try to show you later today, certain theoretical entities that I think exist, or anyway, states of persons. Also we get from a number of Sellers' papers a really sort of rich framework for thinking about varieties of patterned and pattern-governed and rule-following and rule-obeying behavior. And that's going to come up at several points in this discussion, because I think that's a nice framework to both raise and perhaps hopefully answer certain questions about how we should think about certain kinds of psychological states that aren't sort of familiar from the first-person point of view. I'm also going to be focusing on one point in the talk, an idea that came out in David Rosenthal's talk, which we can call the causal theory of expression, which I find in language, thought, and communication, to the effect that a speech act expresses a mental state insofar as the intentional content of the speech act roughly corresponds to the intentional content of the intentional state, and that the mental attitude of the intentional state corresponds to the elocutionary force of the speech act. Okay. Probably the biggest thing that is going to influence my considerations here is Sellers' functional role semantics or inferential role semantics, this holistic semantics that you find in some reflections on language games and meaning as functional classification, and a bunch of other papers. And the idea that when you ascribe a meaning to some natural object, you're not talking about a relation between that object and the world, or not just talking about that, but you are classifying it in respect of its functioning in a larger system. What's going to be particularly important to me is that Sellers stresses the flexibility of those functional classifications. That we'll see some quotes later on, but the rough idea being that these are going to be purpose relative, and they're sort of, you're going to be able to elide certain differences in functional role for certain theoretical or explanatory purposes. I'm going to draw on that idea quite heavily. In mental events, we get this idea of low-grade animal representation systems, and I'm going to be making use of that. I was tempted to put picturing here as well, but that's actually not. I'm not sure if picturing is involved in what I'm about to say, and I would like for some folks here who know better than me to tell me if I should be talking about picturing in this context, or if that's just a separate notion that I should leave aside for another context. Okay, the last two. Sellers distinguishes usefully, I think, between ordinary positions and auxiliary positions in a language game, in some reflections on language games. And I think that that distinction is useful not just in the context of talking about language and personal level intentional states, which is where Sellers intended it to be applied, but also at the subpersonal level, which is where we're going to be for the remainder of this talk. And lastly, I'm going to discuss some of the ways in which semantic or intentional or representational notions for Sellers are fraught with ought, and I want to find out what kind of oughts are involved or appropriate here. So these are the things to keep in mind. I will, of course, flag them as we go along, but these are the ideas that are informing my approach to, or my study of, or my, I guess my study of psycholinguistics, which should, I think, be informed by this more than it is. I feel like oftentimes when I present this stuff to philosophers, I'm dragging philosophers kicking and screaming into an empirical field. And when I present this stuff to psycholinguists, you can imagine the reverse is also true. So, okay, so here's a kind of a game plan, or some leading questions that I'm going to attempt to give some answers to. First of all, what kinds of state do psycholinguists posit? And I'm going to claim here that there are two, that this is not a distinction that's often made, but it's a crucial distinction, it's an important distinction, between what I'll call mental phrase markers and mental syntactic principles. And those are just labels for now. I will explain in more detail than you might want even, what the difference is between those two. But I want to say that there are two kinds of state, and that we're going to want to apply the Salarsian framework for thinking about internal states to differently, depending on which kind of state we're talking about. And I'm going to ask, do these states, whichever one we have in mind, have intentional content? And the answer there is going to be no. No, they don't have intentional content, strictly speaking. They are not conceptual states. They're not conceptually articulated. They don't integrate into our reasoning in the right kinds of ways. They're not inferentially articulated in the right sort of way to have intentional content. But I'm going to want to say that intentional content is just one sort of representational or semantic property, and that these other states that I'm talking about, these subpersonal states, are representations precisely because they are susceptible to a kind of functional role analysis in respect of entries, exits, and quasi-inferential moves. And lastly, I'm going to talk about what's the nature of these states. And I've said that they're subpersonal, but what I found is that when different people say subpersonal, they mean radically different things about it. This has been whole conferences about what subpersonal means to this person versus that person and that person. And so I'm going to try to make clear what I mean by subpersonal, and I think it's a good thing to mean. I think we should mean it by subpersonal. And I'm going to do that by reference to some ideas of Sellers. One of them is that I'm going to claim that these states are subject to weaker normative criteria, or maybe the ascriptions of these states are subject to weaker normative criteria than what we have in mind when we talk about discursive or genuinely intentional states. And I'm going to say about mental phrase markers, which again, for now is just a label, that they are ordinary positions in a subpersonal game, whereas mental syntactic principles, if they even exist, are auxiliary positions in a language game. So that's the sort of game plan, and so let's go. All right. Okay, so it's well known that linguists can model sentences, let's take sentences as our primary explanandum, at a variety of levels of analysis. You can have the phonological level of analysis, which itself splits up into a bunch, including morphophonology and so on. You can talk about syntactics, the syntactic structure of a sentence, and there are a lot of linguists running around thinking that you could do also the semantic or conceptual diagramming of a sentence. I'm less confident about these approaches, but regardless, my own talk here, discussion will be pitched only at this syntactic level. I do believe in the background that everything I say here is applicable equally well to the phonological level, but I just don't know enough about it. I don't feel confident making the strong claims that I'm going to be making about that. So we're going to stick to the level of syntactic structure. And okay, so when people say that a grammar or a system of syntax or some rules or principles of syntax are psychologically real, what is it that they mean? That was the topic of my dissertation research. What does that claim amount to? What could it plausibly mean so that we can see it as maybe true or having some evidence in favor of it? And here again, I wanted to separate two different kinds of posit, of psycholinguistic posit. On the one hand, we can talk about syntactic rules, or as I said, I'd like to label them, well, if we do posit them into the mind, if we import them into the mind, they will be mental syntactic principles. I've here used a fairly simple fragment of a grammar, and even if you're not familiar with these things, some people are, but even if you're not, it doesn't take too long to catch on to what's happening here. So this says that a sentence consists of let's see, does this work? No. A noun phrase and a verb phrase, and or a sentence can consist of just a verb phrase, as in "bring me the thing," right? And then a noun phrase can consist of a determiner and a nominal. The nominal consists of other things. These are just formation rules for building sentences out of smaller parts, or you can think of it as deconstruction rules. If you have a sentence, what you can legitimately split it up into. That's one kind of thing that we could talk about. But another kind of thing we can talk about is what I'll call a phrase marker. And a phrase marker isn't general structural principles, it's a metalinguistic description of a particular sentence, of a particular linguistic item. And in this case, we have this item, "I prefer a morning flight," and we can diagram out its structure, the structure of that particular sentence, using these kinds of tree diagrams. I want to say that the trees are just a notational convention. It's easy to see what's going on when you're using trees, but you can just as well use collapsed sort of bracketed structures like we are familiar with in logic, or you can just use good old plain English, and it would be very long and cumbersome, but this diagram says what this paragraph says. It's just much easier to read the diagram and to play with it and to perform theoretical sort of calculations about it. So nothing essential to the trees here, but this is the sort of thing that I'll have in mind when I say a phrase marker. Okay, now what I'm going to try to convince you for the next 20 minutes or so, for this first substantive part of the talk, is that these phrase markers are psychologically real, that they are in the mind. And then, once I get done convincing you that they're in the mind, then we'll talk about what that means, right? I don't think you'll be fully convinced until we get to be clear about what that claim actually amounts to. But I do want to present to you three types of evidence, neurophysiological evidence, behavioral evidence, for positing why psycholinguists think that these things are in the head, why they think that these are playing a role, that these are really in there in some sense or other. Okay, so let's start off with neural evidence. Okay, so this is evidence from neurocognitive readings that we call ERP readings. These are sort of, you put these things on your scalp and you read where various kinds of activities are that are time locked to a particular stimulus. Okay, and here are two psycholinguists using the word representation. I'm going to give you a bunch of quotes from psycholinguists who use this term so that we know that they really are positing what they take to be representations, whatever that comes out to mean. It says, if the online analyzer, we're thinking of language coming in, and there's this little gadget in your brain that's analyzing the input, is able to immediately detect any grammatical anomaly that it encounters, then it's reasonable to assume that it is constructing representations that include sufficient grammatical detail to detect those anomalies. That's the kind of inference that tribe takes very seriously. Okay, so all right, well, let's see what that means. So suppose you're given a sentence, either in German or in English, like "the shirt was ironed." That has no grammatical anomaly in it, and so that sets a baseline of a neural reading for us. And then you give the same person a sentence that does have a grammatical anomaly, like "the blouse was unironed," And then you get what psycholinguists call a early left anterior negativity. We don't really have to worry about what that means. It means that the brain wiggles in a certain way because of the anomaly. And what's going to be important to me is that it wiggles a certain way precisely when it's a syntactic anomaly. You only get this kind of neural reading when it's a syntactic anomaly. You don't get it when it's a different kind of anomaly. So this is the kind of experiment that you would use to show that sort of thing. You give a person a baseline sentence, a control sentence. The man admired John's sketch of the landscape. Then you give them a syntactically messed up sentence like the man admired John's of sketch the landscape. And the claim there is that in every person's brain in this room just now, that happened. There was a early left anterior negativity. Whereas if we give you this kind of sentence, the man admired John's headache of the landscape, which is grammatically to a certain extent fine because this is a noun, that's fine, it's just like sketch, but you can't have headaches of anything. It's a kind of semantic or perhaps pragmatic violation. Then you get a different kind of neural reading, namely something that happens 400 seconds later, not as in the case of the early left anterior negativity, which is only 100 to 125 milliseconds later. So this, by the way, works whether you present, these are visual presentations of English sentences. Here's another study that did auditory presentations of German sentences. It's the same point. You give people something that in German translates to the finder was rewarded. You get a baseline reading. Then you give them the friend was in the visited, and then you get the eland. But if you give them the cloud was buried, which is fine syntactically, but semantically or pragmatically, they can't ever decide, these people, what semantics or pragmatics exactly is. Not that anybody really can. But they say that this results in a different kind of neural reading. So we know that the brain is sensitive to specifically syntactic phenomena. And now we'd like to know, well, okay, so it's just sensitive to syntactic anomalies, or is there more to say? And there is indeed more to say. So there's this thing that psycholinguists do called priming studies. And with priming studies, what you do is you give people an initial sentence to read. So you give, let's say, one group of people this sentence. IBM moved a bigger computer to the Sears store. And you give another group of people this sentence. Apple sent the newspaper a brand new advertisement. Okay? And the crucial difference about these sentences isn't that they're about IBM or Apple or whatever. The crucial difference is that one of them has a structure where you got a verb, a noun phrase, and a prepositional phrase, whereas the other one has a structure where you've got a verb, a noun phrase, and a noun phrase. That's the syntactic thing is really what's going to be doing all the work here. You then show these groups one and the same picture, and you ask them to describe the picture in the simplest terms possible, and you record the responses. And what you find is that the people who were given the IBM sentence give you this one. They say the man gave the flowers, the man gave some flowers or the flowers to the woman. Whereas the people who were given the Apple sentence give this other semantically equivalent but syntactically distinct description of the very same event, namely the man gave the woman some flowers. And the crucial thing here is that the prime, the people who were given the IBM sentence, they're speaking out, then they're describing the situation using the same syntactic structure, and the people who were given the Apple sentence are describing that very same situation using that syntactic structure. So what's going on there? How do we explain the effect? The way that psycholinguists tend to explain the effect is this. They say, when you read a sentence, a metalinguistic representation of the syntactic structure of the sentence is activated. But it doesn't just sort of pop out of existence. It pops into existence, and then it takes a while to fizzle out. And while it's fizzling out, it still has psychological ramifications. It still has psychological effects, so that if you ask a person within a reasonably short amount of time to describe some sort of situation, then they will they're more likely to, in a certain sense, in a certain psychological or subpersonal sense, reach for the most available syntactic representation there. And since that one was the one that was just activated, that's the one that's going to win the race or be the one to be reached for, is going to be most available or most salient. And so that explains the differences between the two kinds of groups of people. Here, the psycholinguists speak again. They say, the tendency to repeat aspects of sentence structure helps researchers identify some of the representations that people construct when producing or comprehending language. Structural priming, which is an example of what I just showed you, reflects the repetition of representations that are independent of meaning, on the one hand, so not semantic, and independent of sound, so not phonological. They're distinctively syntactic. This is therefore informative about how people represent and use distinctively syntactic structure. So there they are using that funny word represent again. So let's move on to a different kind of data. I think this is maybe the most compelling and most interesting, so this will take the most amount of time out of any of these three. So let's think about these kinds of sentences. These are my favorite sentences. They're super weird sentences. People mostly don't encounter them. In fact, we do a lot of work to not encounter them. But they're called garden path sentences. And what this is a garden path sentence occurs when your language processing system encounters an ambiguity. It's got two ways it could possibly go, way A or way B. And it takes a bet. There's nothing that it can use at this point to tell whether A or B is going to be the right continuation. So it takes, let's say, it makes a bet and says, I'm going to go way A. And then later input in the sentence turns out, oh man, I shouldn't have gone way A. And so you have to backtrack and go down way B, and then you process the sentence correctly. And depending on how hard it is to backtrack, you might never recover and you might never process the sentence correctly, in which case, even though the sentence is perfectly grammatical, you will doggedly insist that the sentence is malformed or ungrammatical or unprocessable or whatever. I think this is best felt from the first person point of view. I'm going to give you a couple of sentences, and I want you to ask yourself, which one of them is not like the others, okay? So here are three. Tell me which one seems to you a little bit funny. So any suggestions? Which one's funny? Yeah. Yeah, that last one's pretty funny, right? You get to the cotton clothing is made of, what's a grow, right? It's made of grows, right? But look, all these three sentences have the same exact syntactic structure for the relevant purposes. Here it is. It's, oh, sorry, I forgot to, anyway. What's going on here is that each of them has deleted an optional complementizer word. It's deleted the optional that. And in the first two cases, it doesn't matter. We just fill in the that, or we treat the thing as a relative clause. But here, there's a little processing snag because cotton clothing is such a high frequency pair that you sort of put it together and you don't even, it sort of stops you from realizing that there's even the possibility of putting in that complementizer. And so you read the cotton clothing as a noun phrase as opposed to the cotton and then the rest of it being a relative clause. Okay, so here are a bunch of others of these. I'm going to leave these up for about a minute and just stop talking so you can sort of appreciate the variety of things that can occur in this context. So, in each of these cases, maybe I should, does anybody still want to keep reading? Okay. In each of these cases, there's a point, some of these are going to be harder than others. You'll find yourself being able to process some of them after a little bit less difficulty than others. Some of them are just, turn out to be unprocessable. I have a couple in my other slides where just nobody ever recovers from them. Nobody, until you explain to them in painful detail what the sentence really means, they don't get it. But here, in each one of these cases, you get to a point, the point that I've highlighted in yellow, and something goes, whoa, what happened, right? So, the plumber told the clients that he was having trouble with the sink, the toilet. No, what is that? Why? But it's actually, he told the clients whom he was having trouble with. It's another one of these relative clause mess ups, and so on. You have the dealer sold the forgeries, complaint. The dealer sold the forgeries, so far fine, but then complaint comes in, and it's hard to know what happened. But again, sold the forgeries. It's the same sort of mistake. These are very common in English, that you mistake something that is a relative clause for something that's not a relative clause, and that's what's going on here. Another famous example is the ship floated down the river, sank, or the horse raced past the barn, fell, and so on. And this is just another one of them. Okay. So there are many types of these, and you can get a whole taxonomy of them, and you can get really rich, detailed explanations for why each one happens the way that it happens. We're going to go through that just a little bit here. Okay. So here's one of these. The cop saw. Sorry, you give one group of people, the spy saw the cop with the binoculars, but the cop didn't see him. The other group of people you give the sentence, the spy saw the cop with the revolver, but the cop didn't see him. This is now not going to be a good test because everybody now has seen both sentences, but you wouldn't do that in a controlled study. And you do eye tracking. So you put really fine-grained eye tracking devices on people's eyes, and you see where their eyes move as they're reading the sentence. And what you find is that after the binoculars, you get just a little bit of lag time, but after the revolver, you get this spike, this sort of, pretty, I mean, look, it says here it's about 60 milliseconds. 60 milliseconds in psycholinguistics is like eons, right? I mean, 60 millisecond spike is like a really significant result. And you got to wonder what happened there, right? This is an obvious behavioral difference. It's a robust result. And so what happened? Why is there a spike after revolver? What's going on there? Here's the explanation, or at least here's the received view about what's going wrong there. Okay? So the person builds in their mind a tree structure, and they build the same one in both cases. And I'll tell you in a minute why they build the same one in both cases. In the case of the binocular sentence, it's all fine. Everything works well. Okay, but in the case of the revolver sentence, the thing actually doesn't work so well because look, what you've got is the seeing happened with the revolver. See, you've got the prepositional phrase modifying the verb phrase to see, and although you can certainly see things with binoculars, this is a perfectly good addition, you can't see anything with a revolver. This is a very non-standard use to see something with, how are you going to do it, right? But what you really want to build is this, right? It's that the cop had the revolvers. You want with the revolver, this prepositional phrase, to modify the noun phrase, not the seeing, not the verb phrase, but the noun phrase. That's what's happening. That would be the right story, right? That would be the right structure to draw or to construct. And this is the wrong one, but this is the one that we construct. And then what happens is, so that's the right one. What happens is, I mean, this is the sketchy model of what goes on. The syntactic processor outputs that description of the sentence, and that gets sent to what these people very loosely call the message processor or the general problem solver or world knowledge or whatever. And then world knowledge comes back and says, dummy, look, you can't see anything with a revolver. You got something wrong. You got to go back and do something. This is just wrong. And that reprocessing, that reanalysis step takes 60 milliseconds, right? That's what's slowing things down, okay? So now, so here's a kind of schematic of what's going on. So you get the words coming in real time. So you're starting to build the structure. So the dealer and then sold comes in. You say, okay, sold. I know the dealer sold. You predict that there's going to be a noun phrase. All right. Then the forgeries comes in. Sweet. The forgeries can be a noun phrase. And then complaint comes in. And then okay. So this is the structure that you should have built to process that sentence. So it carries a lot of extra stuff for the relative clause, except for the relative marker, the word that or whom has been deleted, which is allowed, but there's still a slot for it in the syntactic structure. And notice you would have had to build a much larger structure. Now, what the parser actually does is it follows a kind of principle of least action, or or sort of laziness principle, or an economy principle, parsimony principle, which is don't posit extra structure until you absolutely need to. So the reason you build, the principle is, by the way, called, the principle is called minimal attachment, sort of don't build more stuff than you need to. There's more refined ways of saying that, but that's essentially what it is. And in this case, none of the incoming evidence gave you any reason to posit this crazy extra amount of structure, so you don't. But then when complaint comes in, you realize, maybe I should have, right? So the same is going on with the spy and the revolver. The reason you build this structure, the incorrect one, rather than the correct one, is if you start counting the nodes, there are more here than there are here. You build the simpler one because that's what you always do. And sometimes, it's a heuristic. Most of the time it works out. Most of the time the simpler one is the correct one. And on occasion it's not, in which case then you have to go back and revise. Okay? Now, minimal attachment, that principle, that's true of us. Okay, that's been experimentally tested on in any visual or auditory modality, Braille, whatever, any language you like. It's cross-linguistic. There's no question that minimal attachment is the right story here. There was a question for a while in the 80s. Some people thought they found some dialect of Spanish that doesn't quite behave this way, and then Janet Fodor, who was my thesis advisor, took care of that. So that didn't. Now, in my mind, anyway, there's no question that minimal attachment is true. Now, look, minimal attachment is not represented in anyone's mind. Nobody's claiming that. What we're saying is that minimal attachment is true of you and me, in the same way that celestial mechanics, the principles of celestial mechanics are true of celestial bodies. They're not represented, they're just true. But notice that the principle of minimal attachment mentions these structures, right? It quantifies over them. And so that's a true scientific principle that quantifies over some entities or some states or whatever we're going to want to call them. And so being good Salarzian realists about good theoretical posits, we should believe that these things are psychologically real. Okay, so now either you're convinced that these things are psychologically real, or at the very least you think that there's enough go to that idea that philosophers of language, philosophers of science, philosophers of mind should really start trying to figure out how to work this into their conception of how the mind works and how language works and how perception works. And that is precisely what I propose to do now. Okay. So, and again, of course, my guide here is going to be Wilfrid Sellars himself. So we start off with the myth of Jones. Okay, so that I had to find some Jones on the web, and that's Adam Jones is one of my favorite bands, Tool, and he's the guitarist for it, and arguably a genius. So we can think of Genius Jones tells us, starts off with speech acts, and he looks, Tad Zawitsky, when he saw this talk, said he looks appropriately puzzled and sort of forward-looking, and it's what you would want Jones to be, right? Maybe with less hair, but anyway. So Jones is tells us he gets puzzled, as David Rosenthal was telling us before, about how to explain rational behavior in speech acts, and so he posits these intentional states. Okay, and we go on like that for however many hundreds or thousands of years that's been happening, and then we hit roughly 1957, 1959, depending on who's counting, and you get a new genius. And I want to talk about the myth of Gnome now, what this genius is telling us is that there are these other states that we haven't, that because we haven't really looked into the fine-grained behaviors and haven't gathered the really fine-grained third-person evidence on the basis of which to posit internal states, and because those internal states are not available to introspection or consciousness or from the first-person point of view, we've managed to overlook them for a pretty long time. But now, with the help of Genius Gnome, we're going to get a grip on them. And of course, a lot of Chomsky's students have been on the case for the past several decades, attempting to refine the picture of what these internal states are like, and so on. That's all really impressive empirical work, and we have learned a great deal. We're still due to learn a lot more. But we're going to do the philosophical task of interpreting what are these things? What am I talking about even, right? Okay. The first thing I want to do is I want to distinguish between, or at least I want to draw on Sellars' distinction between ordinary positions in a language game and auxiliary positions. The way that Sellars introduces this distinction in Some Reflections on Language Games, he says, look, you could be, and we can also draw on mental events here, you could be a Humean representational system and go straight from this is a strawberry and it's red to it's ripe. But you could also, in your language game, have these free positions, these positions that aren't arrived at by means of perception and aren't arrived at by means of inference from somewhere else. They're just sort of free positions that you can occupy in the game whenever you see fit or whenever it is fit to do so. These positions are, he calls them auxiliary positions, for that reason, to separate them off from the other ones. And they are essentially standing beliefs. You can think of them as standing beliefs to the effect that all A's are B's. That's his schematic example. I'm going to have all red strawberries are ripe. And you can go from there to the conclusion. Again, this would be an Aristotelian representational system in the terminology that's developed in mental events. And Sellars says, are such sentences properly called positions? Well, their free status, that they're not the result of perception or inference, and their catalytic function make them a class apart. Let's call them auxiliary positions. Okay? But notice he's wondering here, are they really even positions? Is this really something that I have to include in my language game at all? Okay? And the fact that he talks of their catalytic function, because I was sort of, while reading this stuff, also steeped in the psycholinguistic literature, the analogy seemed obvious. Between that and what's going on here. So I've talked about mental phrase markers. Those would be the subpersonal analog of ordinary positions in a language game. And the syntactic rules would be the subpersonal analog of auxiliary positions, which just tell you, which are just standing beliefs about how linguistic structures can be generated. So let me walk you through a kind of example. So suppose you start off with the dealer, okay? You could just move directly to another mental phrase marker, but if you have auxiliary positions in your language game, you can add them, and then, as a kind of next step, go to the next. So look, this says that this topmost node IP consists of noun phrase and verb phrase, and then verb phrase consists of verb and noun phrase, and all of that's going to get built in now here, as a kind of, you might think of it as a conclusion of a subpersonal quasi-inference. And then, of course, you can add some more auxiliary positions, and boom, you get some more mental phrase markers spit out as a conclusion. And so Now, Sellers says that it's conceivable that a language game might dispense with auxiliary positions altogether. He says he entertains that idea. And I have not been able to, and I very much hope that somebody in this room can explain to me why he says this thing that I highlighted in yellow, though at the expense of multiplying positions, because it seems to me that that auxiliary positions don't help you to reduce the amount of positions you've got. You just have the same amount plus the auxiliary ones. But maybe somebody can correct me on that, and that would help a lot. But what he does say is it's not conceivable for the moves to be completely dispensed with, and of course, a fortiori, ordinary positions. You can't dispense with those. The analogy I want to say is, look, these are indispensable. These are here to stay. If you buy the evidence, the kind of evidence that I've been showing you, then really you have to believe that these are psychologically real. But when people talk about the psychological reality of syntax or the psychological reality of grammar, sometimes they don't mean these. Sometimes they mean these. They're wondering, is there a grammar in the mind? Not in the sense of, is there things that are governed by grammar, but is there literally a grammar? If we were able to somehow translate neural phenomena, if we were able to look at a neural phenomenon and interpret it, would we only find these things? Or would we find, in addition, these things here? And so that question, that would take to be one of the central questions in the philosophy of linguistics, are grammatical rules or principles psychologically real? Is in a way kind of, I mean, it's a subpersonal analog of something that Sellers already foresaw in a way, of a phenomenon that he's describing here, namely that you can get rid of the ordinary. Sorry, you have to have the ordinary positions. You can't get rid of those, but you can get rid of the auxiliary ones, and so that is now an option for us. We can now split the debate over the psychological reality of language into two separate questions. One, do you need these? I take the answer to be obviously yes. Two, do you need these? I take the answer to be I wish I knew, right? Having done sort of exhaustive survey of this stuff, I don't see any evidence currently for positing auxiliary positions or these subpersonal analogs of auxiliary positions in the subpersonal language game that I think our language processing systems are employing. That's not to say that we definitely have evidence that they aren't there. It's just that we have no evidence at present to believe that they are there. I think there's much more to say about that story. If you want to ask me during Q&A, I can refine that claim a little bit. But as things stand, I don't see any definitive reason or any reason really to think that these things have to be there in the robust way that mental phrase markers are there. So that's the sort of analogy that you can take from Sellers and recast the psychological reality debate in those terms. And I think it was helpful anyway for me to do so. Okay. Now, Sellers distinguishes between a variety of patterns of activity, a variety of activities. One is you can have patterned activity, which is just conformity to a rule. Maybe everything fits that. Anything that's law-governed conforms to some rule or other. You can have pattern-governed activity, where it's not just patterned, but it's also patterned because that pattern was inherited from a previous pattern, which was of some survival value. And Sellers' example here famously are the bees and their wiring diagram that they inherit from, well, previous generations of bees that that increase their survival value, and that pattern sticks around on account of that increase in survival value. Famously, the foundation of a lot of Ruth Milliken's work into intentionality in general. But Sellers gives us more. He says you can be pattern governed plus. That's not his term; it's mine. But clearly distinguishes that stratum of pattern governedness, where you're not only patterned because you inherited that pattern from a previous pattern, but it's because someone else, the trainer, the people who trained you, your parents, let's say, had an explicit representation of the relevant rule. And then the most high-grade status you can have here is that of rule obeying, where you are pattern governed not only because somebody else had an explicit representation of the rule, but because you have an explicit representation of the rule, and that you know under what circumstances the rule is applicable, and you do the things that you're supposed to do under those circumstances. Okay, now, offhand, it looks like the kinds of states and the kinds of processes that I was talking about are of this very low-grade status right here, just two. Because presumably the reason we have these processing routines, the ways that we structure linguistic input, is the way that it is because there was some survival value to doing it that way, and we've inherited it so it's a genetic inheritance that we have from previous generations. Okay. But now notice what happens if we adopt the view that the auxiliary positions, namely the grammar, the grammatical rules and principles, are also psychologically real, that the subpersonal language game that I've been talking about contains those auxiliary positions. Well, in that case, then it becomes that, well, my mom had a representation of those rules, and part of the reason why I have it is because she had it. So now we get upgraded to here. And then now that I'm an adult, and I would presumably be susceptible to an account where those auxiliary positions are in me, I would also be a rule-obeying creature here. And this starts to look like, wait, this is too high grade. These sorts of things that I was telling you about before, they're very low grade or low-level psychological phenomena. How did we get all the way over here? And I want to say, well, look, we're going to want to distinguish between the personal level of explanation and the subpersonal level of explanation, and you can be a very high-grade subpersonal process, one that is rule-obeying. And I want to make sense of that notion, and I guess part of what I'm doing here is a test run of that notion, see if that notion makes sense to you, that just as you can have rule-obeying phenomena at the personal level, you can also have rule-obeying phenomena at the subpersonal level. I've said that we don't have any evidence for that being the case, but suppose we were to discover some, this is something this is a box that we need to, conceptual box that we need to have in case we need to throw something in it. Now, let's move now to just these guys, the uncontroversial ones. I'm going to leave these very controversial ones behind and focus just on these because there's philosophical problems enough there. So, what is, for Sellers, a mental representation? Well, minimally, it's an internal state, and here I assume it would be like internal to the skin. It's not. There's no like weird metaphor of like internal to the mind, and there's some external. There's none of that. It's just internal to the mind or the skin or the brain, and that bears reliable causal relations to the environment, but also to behavior, and of course, probably most importantly, to other mental representations. So. Famously, Sellers doesn't take what I think most people these days, most people that I anyway interact with in philosophy, just have this knee-jerk reaction that they're going to take a relational theory of representation, where what it means to say that one thing represents another, that X represents Y, is that X bears some relation to Y, and now the hunt is on for what the relevant relation could possibly be, and you have people proposing, oh, maybe it's a kind of resemblance or isomorphism, or maybe it's reliable causation, or maybe it's nomological correlation of some kind, or maybe it's some even more heavy-duty thing like asymmetric dependence and so on. And I think these are all not only non-starters, but known to be non-starters. I think at this point, even the people that push these kinds of theories know that there's something that's amiss here. I don't know. Maybe Fodor thinks that asymmetric dependence really is true. He's very wedded to his views. But I think at this point, if you look at the literature, people are realizing that there's just no go to these at all. And I think Sellers here gives us the way out. I think that what Sellers tells us about meaning talk or meaning ascriptions is the right way to go, is that when you say that one thing represents another or is a representation of another, what you're saying is that that thing is of a certain kind, you're classifying it, and you're classifying it not in respect of its physical features, not in respect of its, you're classifying it in respect of its functional features, the role that it plays in a broader system. Okay? And you're saying that that thing plays the role in its system that some other thing, Y, plays in your language, in a language that you already understand. Okay? That's a crude way of putting it. I realize that there are many refinements that could be made, but I won't make them here. A lot of people here are familiar with what those refinements would be, but illustrating sortals and so on. But what's a functional role account? Well, you need to account, part of it, there's 3 parts to it. There's how the environment causes the relevant state, how those states interact with one another, intralinguistically, so to speak, and what effects they have on behavior. That's, all 3 of those things are necessary to functionally classify a particular item, whether it be a sound or a mark on paper or on a screen or a neural state for that matter, right? So, okay, so what's the Sellarsian view here? I take to be some core theses. There, of course, is an objective world or environment, and there are many relations between that environment and creatures or representational systems. And some of those relations even are partially constitutive of a state's representational properties, its functional classification. But none of the relations are individually sufficient, so that's why purely externalist theories, like the ones that I showed you before, are missing a crucial component. You have to add, and they're not jointly sufficient, you need to add internal language or intralinguistic moves. And for that reason, when you say that something is a representation, you're not saying that there's some reference relation and that it exhibits that relation. I think a lot of people still think in those terms. Certainly, my dissertation advisor, Michael Devitt, was famous for thinking of reference in these terms. That there's just this magical relation, and I think Putnam was right when he said it is truly magical. Magical theories of reference. Okay, now I want to focus on the fact that the role here is flexible. Okay, we have leeway, in fact, maybe a great deal of leeway, in deciding what is the relevant role or what are the relevant similarities between the role that something plays in my language and the role that it plays in a particular target system that I am interpreting or functionally classifying. And he says the criteria, this is Sellers in meaning is functional classification, he says the criteria which an item must satisfy to be and or, I'm sorry, I'm missing an extra single quote there, are a matter of its functioning in respects deemed relevant. That part right there is really crucial. And then he goes on to say, note that the criteria for these sortals, these illustrating sortals, the dot quote sortals, are context dependent. What counts as, and dot quote, or, in one classificatory context, may, in a different one, be classified as like and or in another. Okay, so we have leeway here. This doesn't show that this doesn't say that we have a lot of leeway, but I think his other stuff on conceptual change and his work on conceptual change shows that we have a great deal of leeway. At some point he suggests, I think this might have been just in conversation, but I got this from Jim O'Shea, so I believe it, that he said at one point, yeah, phlogiston is basically, dot quote phlogistons are basically dot quote oxygens, right? And that's a big difference between functional roles, right? And so we obviously have a lot of leeway in certain contexts for certain purposes. Okay. Now, what I want to say is that dot quote that thing is in there. Okay. Now, dot quote that thing. Now that thing plays a really heavy-duty role in my language. Okay, because if you want to ask, well, what role does it play in my thinking in my language? I would give you Hagemann's Introduction to Government and Binding Theory, which is a tome about this thick, and it'll tell you all the stuff about that. And so it's a very big functional role. These kinds of things play a massive inferential role in my inferential economy. And of course, when we're talking about putting them in the brain or putting them into this little gadget that's in your brain that takes care of language processing, you don't want to go ahead and attribute to that little gadget all of the rich inferential and reasoning capacities that we as full-blooded agents have. But this is where the flexibility and the context dependence or purpose dependence of dot quoting or functional classification comes in. Because what I want to say is it plays the relevant, what's in the little gadget in the brain is playing a role that's relevantly similar to the role that it plays in my theoretical structure as a hobby sort of amateur linguist, right? So it's not, when I dot quote that and I say it's in this little gadget in the brain, I don't mean that the little gadget in the brain has all of the rich inferential features or inferential articulation that this thing has in my full-blooded language. That's not what I mean. I just mean it's relevantly similar, that it will have relevantly similar connections to other phrase markers and so on. Now, what's a mental representation in psycholinguistics? We know what it is for Sellers, or we have a decent idea, but what is it for psycholinguists? Well, one thing is that it's got to be a state that mediates between physiological registration of linguistic stimuli, like speech sounds, like the ones that you're getting shot at you now, and the comprehension of the linguistic act, whatever that turns out to be. These states carry information about the syntactic structure of the stimulus, and by here information I mean literally Shannon information, so that, anyway, for those that want to question that later on, we can talk about that. And doing so is their natural function. Function in what sense? Well, either you can ground it in natural selection or you can ground it in learning, and that raises some of the issues that I flagged earlier as to whether we're talking here about just a pattern-governed system or a rule-obeying one. Okay, Moreover, psycholinguists, or particularly computational psycholinguists, will see the relations between these kinds of states as resembling rational inferences, that is, reasonable or logical steps toward a cognitive goal. Here's what I mean by that. You don't have to read this whole diagram. This is just here to tell you that a very popular and what's turned out to be a quite fruitful approach in psycholinguistics is to model parsing, the process of assigning a syntactic structure to an incoming stimulus, as a kind of deduction, where the grammatical rules or the principles of the grammar, the syntactic rules or principles, are either axioms, in which case they really are auxiliary positions, or just rules of inference, in which case they're just things that we conform to but don't obey, strictly speaking. But regardless of that, each line in this proof is a mental phrase marker. Each line in here is a metalinguistic description of some aspect of the sentence, and by the time you get to the end, what you've deduced is the syntactic structure of the incoming stimulus. And given that you can model parsing as deduction, and given that deduction is one of the paradigms of rational inference that we have, we see here a subpersonal analog of that. I don't claim that these are inferences. I don't think they are inferences. I don't think that's the right word for them. It's not a good word to use for them, but they're very much like inferences. Are they not? We see them right there. Okay. So mental representations in psycholinguistics also have to explain behavior, things like eye fixations and reaction times, and the explanation, positing them, abstracts away from largely unknown neural mechanisms. We know roughly, very roughly, what's some of the things where in the brain you might want to go mucking about if you want to look for these things, but we don't know them on anything at the level of detail that I would want, and hopefully will have towards the end of my life. I suppose people tell me what the real story is, but we're getting there. Okay, now here's some crucial things. I think these states are, according to the psycholinguists, why do they call them representations? It's because one of the things that's a necessary condition on something's being a representation is that it can miscategorize stuff. It can make a mistake. And in this case, I think that garden path sentences give us a pretty good example of a case where one of these states makes a mistake about what's going on in the input. Moreover, they allow the language processing system to treat acoustically diverse stimuli as, and that crucial word as there, belonging to the same category. For example, boy and girl, acoustically or visually very different, but they're treated both as nouns for certain purposes of psychological processing. And going the other way, so this is like a many-to-one relation. Here you can have a one-to-many relation. You can have one and the same stimulus, the very same stimulus, right, token stimulus, being treated as one thing at one moment and another thing at another. Okay? So here's an example of this. Take a sentence like, these are the kids who were only very rarely observed in the classroom. What the linguist will say is that there is a kind of gap, what they call a gap, after the word observed, which is co-indexed with or is anaphoric on the kids back here. And that needs to be, that gap needs to be there so that you can interpret the word observed as having the kids as its object, as its grammatical object. And so here's what Janet Fodor says. She says, the antecedents of this kind of gap, so the antecedent in this case would be the kids, of this kind of gap typically cannot, when they are encountered, be recognized as antecedents. So you get in the sentence, you got to imagine you're incrementally building the structure, you get these are the kids, you've got the kids, you know that it's a noun phrase, but you don't yet know that it's going to be the antecedent of a later gap. Okay? But then, as observed comes in and an in comes in, you actually do recognize it as, you recognize the kids as the antecedent of that gap. There are really very clever psycholinguistic studies to demonstrate that that is what is indeed happening, both on the neural level and on the behavioral level. We can talk about those if you like, but you might just take my word for it at this point. And what I want to say is, look, there's no change in the stimulus material. The kids, that sound, is what it was. It happened once and was what it was. However, there's a sudden change in the way that the stimulus is processed, and what that means is that there must have been a change in the way that the stimulus was categorized, or you might say represented. Okay, so how much time do I have left? Does somebody know?
You clearly time for questions, so it's
so 10.
Wrapped up at 5:45.
Oh, that's plenty. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So I've been talking about subpersonal states, and like I said, I want to say more about what that actually amounts to. And so again, one thing we might have in mind here is that subpersonal states are just these pattern-governed ones here. They're just states that are there because the activity that involves those states is merely pattern governed. It's not a kind of rule obeying activity. That's something, again, I want to give a lot of thought to that. Okay, so let's see what that might amount to. I want to go back historically. We start off with Descartes, who made this distinction between the mental, which he equated with the conscious, and the non-mental, which was for him physical and extended. And over the course of history, we get this refinement. We get this refinement where the mental gets split into the conscious and the non-conscious. I put Freud there, not because I think he was the originator of that idea. That's historically inaccurate, but he was certainly a popularizer of it. And so you have at least that distinction there. So now the mental can be not available to first-person inspection. And what linguists will typically do, this is a screenshot from from a 2010 book in Introductory Linguistics by Richard Larson. I don't mean to pick on him as though he's the only one who makes this mistake. Most linguists, when you talk to them, will make some version of this mistake. They'll say, we're talking about tacit knowledge when we posit grammars or mental phrase markers in the mind. We're talking about tacit knowledge. And what do we mean by tacit? Oh, we just mean non-conscious. It's just like you're already comfortable with non-conscious mental states, right? So this is just more of them, right? No problem, okay? But of course, they look very different from the non-conscious intentions or non-conscious desires or non-conscious urges or non-conscious beliefs that we are pretty convinced, anyway, I'm pretty convinced that we have. These states look like they're different not just because they're non-conscious, right? There's something else going on here. In fact, there's a lot of different things, a lot of differences that we can point to between the kinds of states that I've been talking about, the mental phrase markers, and just any old non-conscious, let's say, desire, right? Okay, so what I want to say is actually there's a third. We need to be more fine-grained about our taxonomy here. And we want to say there's conscious states, and then maybe at a certain level lower, I don't know why we don't call it lower, but whatever, they're non-conscious, but also below that, to continue using what seems to me kind of not sensible, really lower, higher vocabulary. But anyway, in addition to that, let's say, there's also subpersonal states. Okay? And then they're genuinely mental, they're, or at least they're psychological, if you want to draw that distinction, but they're not, so they're not here, they're here, all right? They just need extra articulation in our conception of what the mind contains. Okay, so here, obviously, I'm drawing on ideas that are familiar in literature. They're sort of, they've been in the air since the 60s or 70s, so I'm not saying anything terribly new here at all. This stuff, Dennett is not the only person to have put forward this kind of view. I think it's pretty much the standard view in philosophy of psychology at this point, where what you do is you start treating the mind or the brain, and at this point, why make a difference? Why make a distinction between them? You start off treating that as a large-scale system, and then you break that down into subsystems, and then you break those down into subsystems, and so on. Okay, at some point in the breakdown, what you find is you're talking now about subpersonal states. Okay, so what you start off with a whole person, and you're wondering how they can do all the wonderful things that they can do. And so you say, maybe there are little guys inside of me, each one of which has a particular task. One of them's taking care of language, one of them's taking care of vision. I don't know why they're guys. They could have been women as well, or whatever. But anyway, there are these little things in me. Each one of them, well, how do they do the wonderful trick that they do? Well, like how do they do vision or language? Well, you see, they're made up of even littler guys, right? And little guys, how do they do the trick that they do, right? So this one takes care of not all of vision, but you got dedicated guy for distance or brightness or color. And for language, you got a guy that's dedicated to syntax or lexicon or morphology. How do they do that? Oh, well, there's even littler guys, right? And so this one does the lexicon, but this one takes care of just nouns or just verbs or just prepositions, or this one does just one color or just another. And then ultimately, as you know, by the time you're done, you'll be able to the guys will get so stupid or so simple that you can just say, oh yeah, a neuron could do that, right? And then indeed it could, right? So that's the strategy here for reducing what look like complex mental phenomena to neural states. Okay, so this is a more realistic thing. If you want to take vision, you break it down into various kinds of sub-visual processes, a detection of distance or motion or color or whatever. And then distance, well, there's a lot of ways of computing distance. So you might use stereopsis or perspective or motion parallax or whatever. And there, if you're doing stereopsis, then okay, there's a lot of ways of doing that and a lot of things that contribute to the computation. So you do that until eventually, way lower down, you get to the neurons, right? Okay, so these are, this is for the visual system. Obviously, I'm not talking about vision, I'm talking about language. So these would be the little guys, or at least some of the littler guys for language. And there's a syntactic processor in there. So that's the little gadget that I've been talking about this whole time. And now I want to talk about what makes the kinds of states that I've been talking about with all of that in mind subpersonal. What do I mean by subpersonal? What do I think we ought to mean by subpersonal? And I have these 6 criteria here. One of them is that they are invariably non-conscious. Another one is that they are not inferentially articulated or inferentially integrated. A third one is that they are not expressible in speech. They, of course, play a role in speech production and speech comprehension, but they're not expressible in speech. They have no mental attitude. They are clearly susceptible to a computational account, whereas I'll suggest that personal level states maybe are not. And they are, I think most importantly, subject to less demanding normative standards. Okay, so let's go through each one of those, and then that'll be the end. Okay, this is the last sort of stretch. Okay, invariably non-conscious. Well, look, personal level states like intentions or desires or thoughts are sometimes conscious, and then sometimes not. And Sellers, by the way, was one of the first people to really get me into that idea, thinking, wait, there could be states that are mental. It wasn't Freud for me. I hadn't even read Freud all that much. But Sellers says, look, there could be these Rileyans. They're running around. They got all sorts of mental states, but they don't know that they do. And, oh, yeah, wait, why would you have to know? Just because you have them, were they self-illuminating? I mean, if I have, like, $1, doesn't mean I know I have the dollar? Well, no. If I have a mental state, why do I have to know that I have the mental state? Doesn't seem to be, that just seems like a prejudice, right? So, okay, so personal level states could be conscious, could be not. But the subpersonal, they're just always not conscious, right? They're invariably non-conscious. And you got to wonder why. Is it just because, you got to look at the explanations that people often offer for a personal level state being non-conscious. Let's say a desire that's been, well, repressed, maybe repression. But that doesn't make sense in these cases. Nobody's repressing mental phrase markers. That's ridiculous, right? Failure of memory access mechanisms. Well, that's just not true. They're actively playing a role in short-term and, in short-term memory, okay? That maybe sometimes personal level states like perceptions are non-conscious because the presentation of the stimuli is brief or degraded. That's not what's going on here. That's not the reason why mental phrase markers are non-conscious. Maybe it's because of the same sort of thing, weakness of activation in the primary sensory cortex. That's not what's going on here. The activation is quite strong. We can read it on even the crude devices that we have. And sometimes people say, oh, well, sometimes some states are non-conscious merely in virtue of being dispositional, like a standing belief. Take the belief before I ask you the question of whether you've ever ridden an antelope. This is something Dennett says, well, prior to my having asked the question, there was in some sense in which you knew that you've never ridden an antelope, but it's only when I ask the question that the thing becomes manifest or occurrent. Well, some people think that's all there is to being non-conscious. That seems to me an entirely false view. But anyway, even if, whatever the case about these are not dispositional states. Maybe the auxiliary position ones, the syntactic rules or principles, maybe those are dispositional, but the mental phrase markers are not dispositional. They're quite occurrent. Okay, so what I want to say is that these explanations, which are the standard explanations for why a mental state is non-conscious, simply are, implausible or, various degrees of implausibility in the case of mental phrase markers. So what I want to say is that you don't want to confuse the distinction between conscious and non-conscious, which is a real distinction, with the distinction between personal and subpersonal. They are, in some sense, related, but they're not the same distinction at all. They're not entirely orthogonal, but they're not the same distinction, and that's not a good, so sometimes people mean by subpersonal, I've caught this in many, many authors, and in fact, many who should know better, I think, saying, oh, by subpersonal, I just mean subconscious. That's not right. That's not what's going on, right? And that's not a good thing to mean by it. These are two different distinctions. Okay, not inferentially integrated. So take an inference like the one I showed you before. This is a strawberry. It's red, so it's ripe. Okay, this is a strawberry mental phrase marker. Nothing, right? That's not the way that these things function, right? They're not integrated in that right way. I think if I had to find a model for how mental phrase markers are integrated into our mental life at all, it would be on the model of sensations, where they are merely causal antecedents. So I have a mental phrase marker, and there's a purely causal, non-epistemic transition, like the one from a sensation on this Larsian view to a perceptual judgment, where the sensation has no epistemic standing. It's not an inferential relationship. It's just a reliable causal relationship. And so the same thing here. If I get this mental phrase marker, there's a reliable causal process that leads me to the personal level, sometimes even conscious judgment, to the effect that my interlocutor just said that, in this case, the dealer sold the forgeries. Okay, that's the way that I would think of these. They don't have epistemic standing. They're just causal, very interesting, very rich, very worth studying. But anyway, just causal antecedents to our personal level discursive or intentional judgments. Okay, they're not expressible in speech. Here I'm drawing, as I said, I promised I would, on Seller's view, the causal theory of expression, which actually came out in David Rosenthal's talk as well, but and I find it in Language, Truth, and Communication. Is that what I want to say? No. LTC. Jesus, I'm blanking.
Language of thought.
Language of thought and communication, right. Okay, so look, so the idea there is that in order for an intentional state to be expressed by a speech act, this causal notion of expressing is that the speech act content has to match up reasonably well with the intentional state content, and the mental attitude of the intentional state has to match up reasonably well with the illocutionary force of the speech act. But here, so suppose the speech act content is the dealer sold the forgeries. And suppose in the course of producing that speech act, these are involved, by the way, not only in comprehension, that's the context in which I talked about them, but they're also involved in production as well. There's a lot of good production studies showing that. So suppose this is causally involved in my production of that sentence. Well, it does not have the same content, even if you like talking about the content of these things, the representational content. That's not what the speech act content is, so that's already, they're not being expressed. But also in addition to that, although the dealer sold the forgeries, has an illocutionary force, and the mental state has assertoric mental attitude, I think these things don't even have a mental attitude. I think that's another thing that distinguishes personal level states from subpersonal states. So here we have a paradigmatic personal level state ascription. David believes that several people in the room. The believes is the mental attitude. Okay, there's nothing, and there's a bunch of other mental attitudes that we could have slotted in there. David hopes that several people in the room. He fears that several people in the room. He's worried that several people in the room. Suspects, anticipates, and so on. Cutting things up in respect of mental attitude this finely, which we do, and if you read literature, I mean, if you read like Dostoevsky or something, he cuts it up real fine, right? That's got a lot of explanatory and descriptive payoff in the personal level case. There's nothing like that in the subpersonal level case. I mean, you could dig your heels in and say all of the mental phrase markers have assertoric mental attitude. They are all kind of judgment or a kind of belief or a kind of thought. But I don't see the point. I mean, you could say that, but what's the point? These have explanatory power. What's the analogous explanatory purpose there? Sometimes you read psycholinguists; it's very dry stuff, and so they try to get funny every once in a while, and they'll say the human sentence processing mechanism got confused here. And so, there's this talk sometimes you find in the literature of some kinds of mental attitudes or maybe attributions of like emotional like states to this little gadget. But that's just obviously fanciful, obviously metaphorical. And if you ask the psycholinguists, as I've done, they say, "Come on, are you serious? You really think we think that the thing is confused in the same sense that you can be confused? You must be confused." So there's no point in positing mental attitude there. With regard to computational description, I think it's becoming pretty clear that the kinds of states that I'm talking about are susceptible to or the kinds of processes that I'm talking about involving those mental phrase markers are susceptible to a computational description. Indeed, there are many candidates for what the right computational description is. When we go to personal level states, I just don't know, and in fact, I think more likely than not, it's not going to happen. Okay, we have a lot of people arguing for that. There was some arguments on the basis of the frame problem. Fodor in 1983 formulated in his Modularity of Mind, one of the sort of foundational texts of cognitive science. He has his Fodor's first law of the non-existence of cognitive science, is what he calls it. And the law is the more we get to what I would call the personal level state, what he calls the central processor, the less we have any idea how a computational process could even get the beginnings of a grip on this. You have Putnam in his Representation and Reality arguing a similar thing, and most recently you have Robert Brandom in his book Between Saying and Doing, I believe it's chapter 3 or 4, arguing that personal level states are simply not susceptible to a certain kind of computational description which he defines, and I think that's got to be right. I was moved by those arguments. Okay, last thing. Sellers famously says that linguistic objects, or semantic phenomena in general, is fraught with ought. Okay, so if these are some kind of representation, and if Sellers is right about that, then we got to find some ought for these things to be fraught with. Okay? And I think it's a different kind of ought. It's a different kind of normativity than what's involved in the ascription of personal level states. And here I looked at Dennett. Dennett's got these three levels of analysis or stances you can take. I don't like to talk of stances because it implies more stuff about instrumentalism and things like that I don't want to take on board. But anyway, you can look at a system from a variety of perspectives, I suppose. One is you can look at it as just a physical object, in which case you're attributing properties like mass or velocity or temperature, and you're describing the object on that basis. You could also take the design stance, in which case you have to make a certain kind of assumption. The ticket into taking the design stance is a certain kind of assumption, namely that the thing is well-functioning, that it's got a certain telos, it's got a function or purpose, and it's not currently malfunctioning. When you make that assumption, you can now deal with your hand grenade or your DVD player or your alarm clock or whatever, not because you know its internal physical construction, it's just that you know when you pull the pin, the thing blows up, or when you set the button, then the thing will wake you up at a certain time, or whatever. When you press the triangle button, it'll start playing the movie or whatever. With some things, they're too complicated for even all that, so you take the intentional stance towards them, and you see them as a rational agent. And so now we're talking about not objects, not mechanisms, but agents. And agents, the ticket into taking the intentional stance, what you buy, what you pay in order to buy the kind of facility of transaction with certain things, paradigmatically, of course, humans. What you pay, the price you pay is that you have to make a certain kind of very heavy-duty assumption, namely that the thing is rational, in the sense that it puts the beliefs and desires together in the right ways, in ways that aren't stupid, and in the sense that the agent perceives and remembers what it should, and various other sorts of things. And I think that what's distinctive of the kinds of states and processes that I've been talking about, what makes them subpersonal, ultimately, is that when something goes wrong, we don't use the terminology of somebody being stupid. Like, okay, so like take all the sentences that I showed you before. As you were reading them, right, it wasn't that when you realized that something went wrong, that wasn't a failure of rationality on your part. You didn't think, wow, I'm dumb, or I was temporarily, acting or thinking irrationally. What you're more likely to think, and what I think is the right thing to think, is, oh, the little gadget broke, right? Or the little gadget did something funny that it wasn't supposed to do. It malfunctioned, whereas it usually functions quite well. You gave me a stimulus that made it kind of, go out haywire momentarily, okay? So I think that the relevant normative statuses that are occupied by or involved in some way with the kinds of states and processes that I've been talking about are ones that have to do more with teleological teleological notions than with the kinds of rich, rational, or intentional notions that we have at the intentional stance. So these are the 6 criteria. Again, it's just a repeat of that slide, and I think I will finish there. Yeah.
All right, we're running just a little over, but I do want to have some time for questions. Hugh?
David, thank you very much for that. There's a lot there. It's very interesting. I just want to ask you about one slide, the slide in which you tried to persuade us that these things count as representations. And that went by a little bit quickly for me. And I'm puzzled about it, particularly in the light of what you just said about locating these things at the design stance rather than higher up. Now, if I remember rightly, on that slide, at least part of the argument for thinking of them as representations was the one, many, one structure. But it seems to me that I can think of functional systems which have that kind of structure. Think of the functional orientation of the functional organization of a restaurant kitchen, which is taking in different sorts of ingredients and outputting dishes, and you have one, many, and many, one in both directions there, obviously. If you think about how different ingredients go into the same dish, and the same ingredient can go into different dishes. But we're not tempted at all, and you have a notion of correctness, things can go wrong, but we're not tempted at all to think of that as a representation, presumably. So what is it that's why I'm puzzled about what it is that makes these things representations rather than some other kind of functional system.
I guess what I was doing, the kind of project that I was engaged in is a sort of anthropological or interpretive project. It's not that, I mean, I could talk about them as representations. If somebody presses me not to talk that way, I'm happy to not talk that way. I was thinking more about why do psycholinguists call them representations? What's underlying their talk of representations in this context? And it wasn't that any of the criteria or any of the features of these states or processes that I gave was intended to be individually sufficient, or maybe not even any subset of them was supposed to be jointly sufficient. The idea was that mediating between sensory inputs and behavioral outputs, being explanatory of a creature's behavior, being able to miscategorize, having the one-to-many structure and the many-to-one structure. And I mean, I don't remember all of the ones that I mentioned there. All of those taken together are supposed to be what either convinces us to talk about them as representations, or anyway is a good analysis of why the psycholinguists go in for representation talk there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, and I guess the point is the more direct answer to your question is a lot of those things that I just said are not applicable to the kitchen. So some of them, as you point out, might be, but not all of them. And it's really, I was trying to get all of them to be jointly sufficient.
Did you want to follow up?
I realize we're short of time. That's not a very big point.
Okay. Other questions? Linda?
When you've got this mechanism, it's supposed to be subpersonal, and yet the language that you used was that it's got this noun phrase and it's got this verb phrase and it's going, and it has kind of an expectation of what's going to, and I'm thinking that you're being metaphorical in that sense, but what sense is something that's on such a low level has an expectation? I worry about that.
Yeah, so I the way that I would cash that out, and this is one of these, I said expectation, but that's obviously metaphorical or fanciful, and so how do you cash that out in actual sort of causal terms? The idea is that it when you provide, so you feed a person a couple of words, the beginnings of a sentence, and then if you provide certain stimuli, the processing goes on just fine. There's no hiccup, okay? But if you present other stimuli, then there's a hiccup. And the question is, so you can describe that in terms of it was predicting, or it was disposed to function fine if you feed it these stimuli, but if you feed it these other ones, for example, if you leave out the that in certain cases, then it will hiccup. And that is the cash value of expectation. I'm not saying that there really is a mental attitude of expectation on the part of the little gadget. What I'm saying is that if you feed it these things, it'll do this. If you feed it these other things, it'll go off the rails. That's the cash value of that talk.
Can we do one more question?
Are we going to 6? I had a.
We were supposed to be done at 5:45.
Oh. Yeah, go ahead. No, please. Yeah.
No, I feel like I'm keeping everyone. I'm curious if there was in the studies, I'm sorry if I missed it, there's a lot of information, a lot of interesting stuff. I'm just curious in the studies if it was all studies of people reading, or was it audio?
Yeah, it's
A person talking, or just hearing a tape?
it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter,
Yeah.
it all functions the same, huh?
Yeah. So the idea is you can generate. So look, garden path sentences. Part of the reason that you can have them is because they are because the written stimulus often leaves out certain kinds of cues that would be there in a spoken stimulus. You'd have intonation. So I wouldn't say the cotton clothing is made of grows. I would say the cotton clothing is made of grows in Ohio,
Okay.
right? And you don't have that in the written form. Okay.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, that first of all, the written form has certain kinds of cues, intonational cues, paradigmatically the comma, which in certain cases seem to not be necessary. You process the sentence well enough whether there's a comma or not in there, and other ones you need the comma in there. And the question is, why do you need the comma in there? It's because otherwise there's this little syntactic gadget that's going to go haywire if you don't feed it that comma. But now I think the stronger point is that you can have garden path sentences in an auditory case. It takes a little while to set up. I don't have any examples here or off the top of my head, but it's not as though they can't happen. Right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, these are definitely not just reading studies, and it's well worth remembering that the garden path stuff is just one of the many lines of evidence that I presented, which is also just a subset of the many lines of evidence that there are to present that are intended to show that these things are psychologically real. So if it was just the garden path stuff, I would be somewhat convinced, but I wouldn't be bowled over. But we've got all the neuro stuff, we got the priming stuff, we got other things that I didn't mention, and that all is supposed to jointly bowl you over. It certainly did for me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.